Most people do not miss major turning points because nothing happened. They miss them because what happened looked too subtle at first. That is exactly why you need to watch this. August 15th to 17th may not announce itself through drama, but through recognition. Through the moment a relationship stops making emotional sense, through the instant you realize your current path no longer matches who you are becoming, through the pressure of knowing that delay now costs more than change. If you have been waiting for a sign, this may be it. And before this video is over, you may understand why these next 3 days could reshape far more than your schedule, your mood, or your plans. This is not the kind of moment that asks for your attention by force. It asks for your attention by pattern. A conversation that lands differently than it should. A delay that suddenly makes emotional sense. A person acting in a way that reveals more than they intended. A thought you have avoided for weeks, returning now with unusual precision. These do not always arrive as isolated incidents. They often belong to the same larger movement. And when that movement starts, the biggest mistake most people make is assuming they still have more time than they actually do. There is a particular kind of tension that builds before a real-life change. Not panic exactly, and not excitement either. It feels more like standing in a room where the pressure has changed, even though every object in that room still appears to be in the same place. You can still recognize the furniture. You can still move through your routine. You can still tell yourself, nothing major is happening, and yet some deeper part of you has already stopped believing that explanation. That is the tension many people are carrying right now, the sense that the old emotional arrangement is ending, even if the visible evidence has not fully caught up yet. What makes August 15th through 17th so important is not only that something new may begin, it is that the truth of what has already been shifting becomes much harder to ignore. This window carries the energy of revelation, but not necessarily in the theatrical sense people imagine. Revelation often arrives as recognition. You finally see why a door stayed closed. You finally understand why your motivation has felt inconsistent. You finally recognize that what looked like confusion was actually misalignment. You finally see that what drained you was not only the workload, but the way you had been shrinking yourself in order to carry it. That is why this period can feel intense without looking intense from the outside. A rare shift does not always begin by rearranging your circumstances. Often, it begins by rearranging your relationship to them. And once that happens, the practical changes tend to accelerate. Because the hardest part of any transition is not taking action. The hardest part is reaching the point where your internal truth becomes too clear to keep negotiating with. When that point arrives, even small decisions start carrying unusual force. A delayed reply becomes a boundary. A quiet idea becomes a plan. A private realization becomes the beginning of an entirely different life. If you have been asking for a sign, be careful not to imagine that signs only count when they arrive dramatically. Sometimes the sign is that you are no longer able to remain emotionally asleep in a place where you once functioned on autopilot. Sometimes the sign is that your patience has changed shape. Sometimes the sign is that what used to tempt you no longer feels convincing. Sometimes the sign is that the version of you who would have accepted less is becoming harder to access. That, too, is change. And in many cases, it is the most important kind. Because visible breakthroughs usually follow invisible decisions. The reason this shift matters so much is that it seems to be arriving in layers. The first layer is awareness. You begin noticing what is off, what is ending, what is no longer asking to be repaired, but released. The second layer is discomfort. Once you see clearly, you can no longer enjoy what depends on your denial. The third layer is motion. What felt impossible to address 2 weeks ago now begins to feel unavoidable. And the fourth layer, the one that changes everything, is the moment you stop asking whether you are ready and start realizing that staying the same now costs more than moving forward. That sequence matters because many people misread their own process. They assume discomfort means they are doing something wrong. In reality, discomfort is often the evidence that clarity is doing its work. When an old illusion begins losing power, it rarely leaves quietly. It tries to negotiate. It tells you to wait a little longer. It tells you you are overreacting. It tells you this is not the right moment. It tells you you should be more certain before you choose differently. But rare shifts do not usually arrive when you feel perfectly prepared. They arrive when truth becomes more trustworthy than hesitation. Think about how many lives remain unchanged, not because opportunity never appeared, but because the opportunity did not match the person's preferred emotional timing. People say they want a new chapter, but what they often mean is that they want a new chapter that does not require them to release the old one yet. They want clarity without consequence, movement without uncertainty, a better future without the vulnerable middle. And this window does not support that arrangement. August 15th to 17th has the feeling of exposure. It shines on what you already know. It amplifies what you have delayed. It makes the middle visible. For some people, this will move through relationships, not always through a dramatic ending, but through a sudden inability to keep translating someone else's inconsistency into hope. You begin noticing the emotional arithmetic more clearly. Who leaves you drained? Who only arrives when it serves them? Who speaks warmly but acts vaguely? Who seems to need your understanding while offering very little clarity in return? The rare shift here is not necessarily that another person changes. It is that your tolerance for ambiguity starts collapsing. And when that happens, the story changes very quickly, because much of what has been prolonged in your life has been prolonged by your willingness to keep interpreting mixed signals as future potential. For others, the shift will move through work, calling, or identity. What used to feel merely tiring may now feel impossible to fake. The way you speak about your future may no longer match what you actually want. You may notice that certain plans sound correct but feel lifeless. You may realize that the path you were trying to force was not wrong in some universal sense, but wrong for the version of you that now exists. This can feel disorienting at first, because identity shifts often arrive before strategy does. You know you cannot continue in the same way, but you do not yet have the full map of what comes next. That gap can feel uncomfortable, but it is not empty. It is creative. And that is one of the most important things to understand about this August 15th to 17th window. It is not only about endings, it is about the exact moment when endings begin converting into available energy. What leaves your life does not merely create absence, it creates usable space. It returns focus. It returns emotional bandwidth. It returns self-respect. It returns the ability to hear your own thoughts without so much interference. This is why some changes feel painful and relieving at the same time. You are not only grieving what is passing, you are meeting the part of yourself that was buried beneath it. There is also a quieter dimension to this shift that many people miss entirely. Not every major change begins with a crisis. Some begin with increased precision. Your intuition becomes less foggy. Your attention becomes more selective. You stop trying to rescue what has shown no willingness to grow. You become less available for emotional theater. You notice how often your energy has been spent managing instability that was never yours to manage. These are not small changes. They are foundational. Because once your discernment sharpens, entire categories of delay begin disappearing from your life. That is why the phrase, "this changes everything," is not always an exaggeration. A life can be changed by one clear thought, if that thought rearranges your standards. A future can change because of one honest conversation that finally names what both people have been avoiding. Momentum can change because you stop feeding your best energy into uncertainty and start directing it toward what is mutual, what is real, and what is actually growing. Most major transformations do not begin when the world becomes more obvious. They begin when you stop overriding what you already know. Still, this window is not only about insight, it is also about response, and this is where the tension begins to rise. Because once clarity appears, you are asked to answer it, and response is where many people stall. They enjoy recognition, but hesitate at embodiment. It can feel strangely easier to understand your next chapter than to begin acting like the person who belongs in it. That is why this period may bring not only revelations, but opportunities to prove to yourself that your awareness is real. A boundary you have postponed, a message you need to send, a habit you need to break, a standard you need to stop apologizing for. If this sounds intense, it is because genuine turning points usually are. Not always on the surface, but at the level that matters. They ask you to choose between familiarity and alignment. They ask whether your loyalty is still pointed at your comfort or finally pointed at your future. And that choice becomes especially significant in periods like this, because the emotional cost of self-betrayal becomes unusually visible. What you once brushed off now feels heavier. What you once justified now feels more expensive. What you once tolerated now feels almost physically incompatible with where you are trying to go. This is where the rare shift begins pressing more directly on your life, because it is one thing to sense that a huge change is coming. It is another to realize you may already be inside the first stage of it. That is often the part people miss. They imagine transformation as an event waiting in front of them, when in reality, it has already started through perception. The life you are leaving rarely disappears all at once. It loses authority gradually. It becomes less persuasive. It stops feeling like your future and starts feeling like your history, even while you are still physically standing inside it. If you have felt emotionally between worlds lately, this may be why. You can still access the old routines, but they no longer fit cleanly. You can still try to think the old thoughts, but they do not fully convince you. You can still revisit old hopes, but they may now feel connected to an earlier version of you. That in-between state can be deeply uncomfortable, especially for people who like clarity and definition. But it is also one of the most fertile stages of any real transformation, because it is where identity loosens enough for something truer to emerge. And yet there is one obstacle that returns again and again during windows like this: the temptation to downplay what you know because acting on it might change more than you initially intended. If you admit that a relationship has expired, what else will need to shift? If you acknowledge that your current path no longer fits, what conversations will follow? If you stop settling emotionally, what structures in your life will no longer survive? These questions are real. They matter, but they do not become less powerful by remaining unnamed. In fact, unnamed truth tends to govern a life more strongly than spoken truth ever does. That is why August 15th through 17th may feel like pressure, but it is often the pressure of emergence rather than collapse. Something within you is trying to become more coherent. Something is trying to organize your energy around what is honest instead of what is merely familiar. And coherence changes everything because it simplifies what once felt impossibly complicated. When you are no longer split against yourself, decisions become cleaner. Time becomes more useful. Attraction becomes more accurate. Even grief becomes more dignified because you are no longer grieving from confusion, but from clarity. There is another reason this period can produce unusually high emotional intensity. Once people begin sensing that a big change is near, they often start bargaining with it. They tell themselves they can carry the new energy into the old structure. They imagine they can preserve every existing attachment while also stepping into a more aligned future. Occasionally that works, but usually only when the old structure has enough integrity to evolve with you. If it does not, then the attempt to keep everything becomes the very thing that delays what is trying to arrive. Rare shifts ask for honesty about what can come forward with you and what cannot. This does not mean you need to make dramatic choices recklessly. It means you need to stop pretending that clarity is not already here. There is a difference between patient action and emotional postponement. Patient action recognizes timing. Emotional postponement hides behind it. Patient action gathers what it needs and then moves. Emotional postponement keeps asking for one more sign, one more week, one more guarantee, one more version of certainty that real life rarely offers. And this window may expose exactly where that pattern has been operating in you. So what does it look like to move well through a shift like this? First, it looks like taking your own recognition seriously. If something has become clear, stop treating that clarity as a passing mood. Write it down. Speak it honestly. Let it become specific. Vague awareness is easy to dismiss, but named truth starts building momentum. Second, it looks like reducing the noise around you. Not every opinion deserves access to your transition. During turning points, too much external input can blur what was finally becoming sharp. Protect the new signal while it is still strengthening. Third, it looks like watching where your energy naturally wants to go when you stop forcing it elsewhere. What becomes easier when you stop performing attachment to what is no longer alive for you? What idea keeps returning? What conversation feels overdue but strangely relieving to imagine? What version of yourself have you been circling for months now without fully inhabiting? These questions matter because genuine change rarely enters a life randomly. It tends to move along the path where truth and energy are starting to converge. Fourth, it looks like understanding that not every loss during this period is a punishment. Some losses are clarifications, some disappointments are redirections, some delays are exposures, some endings are the only way to return your life to a shape that can actually support what you have been asking for. This can be difficult to accept in the moment because the mind prefers immediate interpretation. It wants to know whether something is good or bad right away. But many of the most important changes in a person's life only reveal their intelligence later. That is why the emotional tone of this period can feel so mixed. There can be grief and relief in the same hour. Fear and excitement can sit very close together. You may feel both tenderness for what is ending and certainty that it must end. Do not misread that complexity as confusion. Complexity often means you are emotionally awake enough to feel multiple truths at once. And that honesty is one of the reasons this window can become such a powerful pivot. You are no longer reducing your reality just to make it easier to tolerate. Now here is where the tension rises further, because rare shifts do not remain theoretical for long. Between August 15th and 17th, many people may find that the thing they have been sensing internally begins showing up through real-world confirmation. A message arrives. A pattern repeats too clearly to dismiss. Someone reveals their true level of effort. An opportunity appears that feels strangely timed but unmistakably aligned. A sudden wave of exhaustion tells you exactly where your spirit has been overextended. When external reality begins echoing internal truth like this, the period becomes much harder to ignore. And that is exactly why windows like this can change lives. Not because they magically do the work for you, but because they remove enough ambiguity that your next step becomes visible. Once a next step is visible, hesitation loses part of its power. You are not wandering in uncertainty anymore. You are standing at a threshold you can either cross or avoid. That is a very different kind of pressure. It is not the pressure of not knowing. It is the pressure of knowing and deciding whether you will honor what you know. Many people underestimate how much energy is drained by living against known truth. They think their exhaustion is caused only by bad luck, by overthinking, or by difficult circumstances. Sometimes it is, but often a large portion of that exhaustion comes from maintaining internal contradiction, saying yes where the body means no, holding hope where evidence has repeatedly argued otherwise, remaining available to dynamics that continually reduce your sense of self. This window has the potential to expose that contradiction very clearly, and if it does, the relief may arrive not when everything gets fixed, but when you finally stop participating in what has been weakening you. There is something almost sacred about that moment. The moment when the self stops negotiating its own worth. The moment when desire becomes cleaner because it is no longer mixed with desperation. The moment when your future stops depending on being chosen by what cannot truly meet you and starts depending on your willingness to choose what is reciprocal, honest, and expansive. Those moments are rarely loud, but they are often irreversible, and that is why a 3-day period can alter the direction of months or even years. If you are wondering whether this really applies to you, consider this simple measure. What truth has become repetitive lately? What keeps returning, no matter how you try to distract yourself? What theme keeps appearing through different people, different moods, different conversations, different forms of delay or desire? Repetition is one of the clearest languages of transition. Life often repeats a lesson, not to punish you, but to make sure you notice where the doorway actually is. By the time a pattern becomes obvious, change is usually much closer than people think. This is also why the next few days reward honesty more than performance. You do not need to appear completely certain to move correctly. You do not need to impress anyone with how composed you are. You do not need a perfect explanation for why something has stopped fitting. What you need is willingness. Willingness to stop decorating what has become empty. Willingness to let reality be reality. Willingness to believe that alignment may initially cost comfort, but eventually return power. That kind of willingness creates momentum faster than most people realize. And once momentum begins, your life can reorganize surprisingly quickly. One clear no makes room for a better yes. One ended cycle returns energy to your mind. One respected boundary changes who has access to you. One honest admission changes what opportunities you can even perceive. This is why huge changes often look sudden to outside observers. They did not witness the weeks or months of invisible preparation. They did not feel the quiet rehearsals of courage happening in your inner life. They only saw the visible decision. But visible decisions are usually the final movement of a much deeper process. So, as August 15th through 17th unfolds, do not focus only on what the world is doing around you. Focus also on what is becoming impossible to pretend within you. That is where the rare shift begins. That is where the future first forms. The world you experience externally is often changed first by the standards you stop violating internally. And once those standards change, your timing changes, your choices change, your capacity changes, and the kind of life you can sustain changes with them. It is also worth remembering that a huge change is not always a dramatic addition. Sometimes it is subtraction. Sometimes the miracle is not that something new enters immediately, but that something false finally leaves. Space is not emptiness when it has been created by truth. Space is readiness. Space is a field. Space is where the next right thing can finally land. Many people say they want clarity, but when clarity arrives as subtraction, they mistake it for loss alone. Look more carefully. Sometimes what feels like removal is actually preparation at a very high level. There is another layer here, one that matters more than most people expect. When a shift like this begins, it does not only remove what no longer belongs, it also exposes what you have been spiritually rehearsing for without realizing it. The conversations you have avoided have been training your voice. The disappointments you have lived through have been refining your standards. The seasons that felt slow were often building tolerance for truth. That means this moment is not arriving in a vacuum. It is meeting a version of you that has already been changing in private, even if your outer life has not fully reflected it yet. That is why these next few days may feel strangely personal. Not because the world is revolving around you, but because life is reflecting you back to yourself with unusual precision. It shows you where you still collapse. It shows you where you have already grown. It shows you the places where you still ask permission to honor what you know. It shows you the places where your strength is finally becoming natural rather than performed. And that kind of reflection can be deeply confronting because it removes many of the stories we use to delay our own next chapter. Some people will notice this shift through restlessness. They will feel unable to continue pretending they are fulfilled where they are not. Others will notice it through grief, a sudden understanding of how long they have remained loyal to something that has not truly loved them back. Others will notice it through energy itself. The body becomes more honest before the mind catches up. Fatigue around one path. Lightness around another. Resistance where there used to be attachment. Calm where there used to be confusion. These signals matter, especially during a window like this, because the body often recognizes transition before the intellect can explain it. There is also a risk in periods like this, and it is worth naming clearly. Once truth becomes visible, people sometimes rush to resolve it too quickly. They want immediate closure, immediate certainty, immediate proof that the discomfort is leading somewhere meaningful. But this window is not asking for frantic movement. It is asking for aligned movement. There is a difference. Frantic movement is driven by the need to escape discomfort. Aligned movement is driven by the willingness to act from what is real. One creates more noise, the other creates direction. If you remember that, you will move through this period with far more power. And power, in a moment like this, is not aggression. It is clean self-trust. It is the ability to stop abandoning your own perception just because a truth has consequences. It is the courage to let your life reorganize around something more honest than habit. It is the refusal to keep paying emotional rent in places that no longer hold your future. That is the kind of power hidden inside rare shifts. They do not always make you feel strong at first. Sometimes they make you feel exposed. But if you stay with them long enough, exposure becomes liberation. By the time this window closes, some people will have only observed it. Others will have moved with it. The difference will not necessarily be intelligence, spirituality, or courage in the abstract. It will be willingness to respond while truth is warm. That is the real test of turning points. Not whether you noticed them eventually, but whether you recognized enough to meet them while they still carried momentum. Life does not always ask for perfect certainty. Sometimes it asks for clean participation. And maybe that is the deepest message of this entire August 15th to 17th shift. What is changing is not only your circumstances, it is your threshold for misalignment. It is your appetite for delay. It is your tolerance for what confuses, drains, or diminishes you. Once those thresholds move, everything downstream begins moving too. Your relationships change because your standards change. Your work changes because your energy changes. Your future changes because your honesty changes. That is how rare shifts work. They alter the inner architecture first, and then visible life follows. So if these days feel strange, heavy, revealing, or unexpectedly clear, do not rush to normalize them. Stay close. Listen carefully. Notice what keeps repeating, what feels newly obvious, what no longer deserves negotiation, what quietly wants to begin. You may be standing in one of those deceptively ordinary moments that later becomes a dividing line in your story. Not because thunder announced it, but because truth finally became stronger than avoidance. If that is where you are, then let these days do what they came to do. Let them expose what is hollow. Let them strengthen what is real. Let them pull your attention away from what merely consumes you and back toward what can actually build a life. Let them show you that change is sometimes less about becoming someone else and more about refusing to keep abandoning who you already are. And if you can meet this window with that kind of honesty, then yes, this may be the kind of shift that changes everything. Because in the end, the most life-altering moments are rarely the ones that flatter your comfort. They are the ones that return you to yourself. They interrupt the habits that kept you numb. They break the spell of waiting. They reveal that the future you want is not blocked by fate, as much as it has been delayed by tolerance for what no longer matches you. August 15th through 17th may be that kind of moment. Quiet on the surface, decisive underneath. And if you feel that, trust it. Some shifts do not ask to be understood immediately. They ask to be honored while they are still unfolding. If this message found you at the right time, pay attention to what these next few days show you. Notice what closes, what clarifies, what weakens, and what unexpectedly begins to strengthen. Notice where your peace increases and where your energy contracts. Notice which truth feels impossible to unsee now. Because the person you become after an honest window like this is rarely the same person who entered it. And that is not something to fear. It may be the very answer you have been waiting for. So, move carefully, but do not move asleep. Stay open, but do not stay available to what keeps draining you. Listen deeply, but do not keep translating confusion into hope. Let the old pattern finish if it is already ending. Let the new standard form if it is already rising. Let your life become simpler where truth has already made the decision clear. And if these 3 days truly are the threshold they seem to be, then the greatest change may not be what happens around you. It may be that you finally stop doubting what you already know.